Welcome to the deep dive. You know that feeling when you catch someone staring?
Yeah, a little unnerving, maybe.
Right. But it usually passes. Today, though, we're going much deeper. We're looking into scopophobia.
Which is
Yeah.
that really significant anxiety disorder, the overwhelming fear of being stared at.
Exactly. It's important, I think, to separate that common self-consciousness from what scopophobia really is.
Absolutely. We're focusing on when that fear becomes, well, extreme.
Yeah.
So extreme, it really messes with your daily life.
Right. And to get a handle on this, we've looked into some really interesting sources.
Yeah, we'll break down what scopophobia actually is, the symptoms people experience.
Potential causes, maybe where it comes from, its history too, and how it's treated.
Our goal is really just to understand the core of this specific fear, its roots, how it's been seen over time.
Hopefully offer some clarity, maybe even a few surprising insights along the way.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. What exactly is scopophobia? Define it for us.
Okay, so fundamentally, scopophobia is an anxiety disorder. It's marked by this excessive, persistent fear of being stared at.
In public or just by people generally?
Either, really, in public spaces or even just around certain people. And interestingly, it has a few different names.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, besides scopophobia, you might hear ophthalmophobia. And then there's one I find kind of memorable, spotligectophobia.
Ejectophobia.
Yeah, it sort of captures that feeling, doesn't it? Like
Yeah.
being stuck in a spotlight, intensely watched.
It really does paint a picture. So this isn't just like feeling a bit shy or not wanting attention.
No, no, definitely not. It's much more severe. And what's interesting is how the source material classifies it.
How so?
Well, it's seen as both a social phobia, because, it happens in social settings, and a specific phobia,
Okay.
because the anxiety is so tightly linked to that one specific trigger,
Mhm.
the act of being stared at.
Got it. That distinction makes sense. So for someone going through this, what does it actually feel like? What are the symptoms?
They can hit on both emotional and physical levels. Emotionally, you're looking at intense, often irrational panic.
Just sheer panic.
Yeah, or feelings of terror, real dread, significant general anxiety, and this really strong urge to just avoid situations where they think they might be watched.
Okay, and the physical side.
Yeah.
Anxiety often shows up physically.
Right, absolutely. And a lot of the physical symptoms overlap with other anxiety disorders.
Like what?
Things like a racing heartbeat, feeling short of breath, maybe nausea, dry mouth, trembling, that kind of thing.
Standard anxiety responses almost.
Pretty much, but there can also be some less common but still pretty impactful reactions too,
Such as?
like hyperventilating, really noticeable muscle tension, dizziness, sometimes uncontrollable shaking, even eye stuff like excessive watering or redness.
Wow, that sounds incredibly distressing. The overview we read even mentioned something particularly serious for people with epilepsy.
Yes, and that's a really crucial point. It highlights the potential severity. For someone with epilepsy, the intense stress and anxiety that comes from feeling stared at, well, in some cases, it can actually be enough to trigger a seizure.
Wow, that really drives home that this is a serious condition, not just feeling awkward.
Exactly. And it sounds like it doesn't often show up completely on its own.
That's right. The information we have suggests scopophobia often co-occurs with other anxiety disorders.
Hmm.
It's also been linked, or associated at least, with conditions like schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders.
But it's treated separately.
Yeah, that's important. Even when it exists alongside these other conditions, scopophobia is usually recognized and treated as its own distinct challenge.
Hmm.
Okay, so we're getting a clearer picture of what it is, how it manifests. Let's think about causes.
Mm.
What might lead someone to develop this intense fear?
Well, the sources point to a few potential origins. One big one seems to be some kind of traumatic event.
Like what kind of event?
Specifically, public ridicule or humiliation, especially during childhood, that seems to be a significant potential trigger.
Yeah, you can see how that would stick with you.
Definitely. Imagine feeling that intense shame, that vulnerability, being mocked publicly as a kid. That could easily lay the groundwork for a fear of scrutiny later on.
That makes sense. Those early experiences can run deep. The overview also mentions something about physical disabilities.
Yes, that's another factor. If someone is frequently stared at because of, say, a visible physical disability, they might also develop scopophobia.
So it's like the staring itself becomes the trigger.
Kind of. It's like the constant attention, even if it's not meant maliciously, gets associated with discomfort and anxiety over time. A cumulative effect, maybe?
Right, the sheer repetition of it. Now, the info also gave some stats on social anxiety more broadly.
It did. U.S. government data from 2012 estimated over 7% of the population had social anxiety at any given time.
Wow, 7%.
And that number jumps to about 13% when you look at it over a whole lifetime.
So pretty common then, social anxiety in general.
Yeah. And while that's broader than just scopophobia, it gives you a sense of how prevalent these kinds of anxieties are.
Okay, and then things get a bit more theoretical. The psychoanalytic views, something about Freud and the evil eye.
Exactly. This is where it gets kind of fascinating. Drawing on Freud's ideas, like the eye being an erogenous zone,
Yeah?
psychoanalytic theory suggests scopophobia might be tied to a repressed fear of looking, but also an inhibition of exhibitionism, like a fear of being seen in a way that feels really exposed or vulnerable.
So afraid to look and afraid to be looked at.
Something like that. Freud actually talked about scopophobia in relation to a dread of the evil eye. He connected it to this internal function of like observing and criticizing yourself.
An inner critic.
Yeah, like a harsh inner judge that's always watching. And then the gaze of other people becomes this external trigger that just activates that harsh judgment inside.
So the fear of external judgment mirrors a really strong internal self-judgment.
That seems to be a key idea. The source also talks about shame being a really powerful motivator here. Shame. How so?
Like the act of being looked at gets tangled up with feeling negatively judged, criticized, or even despised.
And this connects to that heightened self-consciousness you often see in teenagers, right? The whole looking glass self idea.
Exactly. Adolescence, when you're suddenly very aware of how others see you, that fear of negative judgment can be super intense. And that could apparently amplify things like erythrophobia, the fear of blushing, and also contribute to scopophobia developing or getting worse.
Huh. It's really interesting how these anxieties can feed into each other. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about the history? This isn't a brand new idea, is it?
Not at all. The whole concept of social phobias goes way, way back.
How far back?
The source mentions Hippocrates around 400 BC.
Oh, really?
Yeah, describing someone overly shy who, quote, loves darkness as light and thinks every man observes him. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it?
It really does. An ancient observation of what we'd call social anxiety, with maybe some scopophobia mixed in. Incredible. It is. Fast forward quite a bit, though, for more formal recognition.
Okay, when did psychiatry start using specific terms?
Well, the term social phobia itself was apparently coined in 1903 by a French psychiatrist, Pierre Janet.
There.
He used it for patients who were afraid of being watched while doing everyday things like talking or writing.
And scopophobia specifically?
That came just a few years later, in 1906. A psychiatric journal, the Alienist and Neurologist, specifically used the term scopophobia.
What did they say about it?
They described it as a morbid dread of being seen, something they observed in asylum settings back then.
Morbid dread, that's strong language.
It is, and they even noted different levels of severity.
Oh.
Yeah, milder forms they called morbid shamefacedness, maybe someone constantly trying to hide their face. And then more severe forms where people would actively shun others, go to great lengths to avoid being seen at all.
So a real spectrum of avoidance.
Exactly. And interestingly, they noted back then in 1906 that it seemed more common in women. Their definition was pretty straightforward. A fear of seeing people or being seen, especially of strange faces.
So it's been on the psychiatric radar as a distinct thing for well over 100 years. Let's talk about the word itself, scopophobia. Where does that come from?
It's Greek. Scope means something like look to or examine.
Okay,
And phobos, as many people know, means fear. So literally fear of being looked at or examined.
makes sense. And the other one, ophthalmophobia.
Also Greek, ophthalmos means eye. So fear related to the eye.
Right. And spoliogekthophobia is just that modern mashup.
Yeah, combining the spotlight effect idea with phobia. Kind of clever, actually.
It is. Now, the sources also listed some related concepts. Why is it useful to know about those?
Well, it helps draw the lines, to understand what scopophobia is by seeing what it isn't, or what it's related to but distinct from.
Like what?
Like, scopophilia. That's crucial to distinguish. Scopophilia isn't fear, it's getting excessive pleasure from looking at others. Totally different thing.
Right, the opposite almost.
Pretty much. Then there's stuff like erythrophobia, that fear of blushing we mentioned, social stigma, stage fright. They can be related, but aren't the same core fear.
What else is mentioned?
The concept of the gaze in social theory, the generalized other, that's like our internal sense of what society expects or how people see us, and ideas or delusions of reference.
Delusions of reference.
Yeah, where someone mistakenly believes random events or strangers or specifically focused on them. You can see how that might feel like being watched, but the underlying mechanism is different from the specific phobia of being stared at.
Gotcha. So while there can be overlaps, scopophobia's core is really that fear of being seen, being scrutinized.
Exactly.
Okay, so if someone is dealing with this, what help is out there? What treatments do the sources mention?
Thankfully, there are several approaches. One is desensitization therapy.
How does that work?
It might involve being intentionally exposed to being stared at for a bit, then talking through the feelings. The idea is to either gradually reduce the sensitivity or maybe uncover the root cause of the fear.
Sounds potentially intense.
It could be, which might be why exposure therapy is also common and often more structured.
What does that involve?
Usually 5 steps. First, an evaluation understanding the fear. Second, feedback from the therapist. Third, developing a fear hierarchy.
A list of scary situations.
Yeah, from least scary to most scary, all related to being stared at. Fourth is gradual exposure to things on that list in a safe way. And fifth, the goal is building tolerance, reducing the anxiety response at each step.
That step-by-step approach sounds maybe more manageable for some. Any other therapies?
Yeah, the sources also list hypnotherapy, NLP, that's neuro-linguistic programming, and something called energy psychology.
Okay, a few different angles there. What about medication?
In more extreme cases, yes, anti-anxiety meds can be part of the plan. Things like benzodiazepines for short-term, intense anxiety, or antidepressants, which can help more long-term with the underlying anxiety. And sometimes beta blockers, which mostly help with the physical symptoms, like the racing heart.
Good to know there are options depending on the person's needs. Now, just shifting perspective again.
Yeah.
Pop culture. Does scopophobia show up in fiction?
It does, actually. It's interesting to see it portrayed, like, in The Never-Ending Story, the Akaris.
Oh, yeah. They hide because they think they're ugly.
Exactly. They're so ashamed they avoid daylight, avoid being seen at all. That's a pretty clear parallel.
Definitely. Any others?
There's a character in a Japanese light novel series, Okami-san, named Ryoshi Marino. He has severe scopophobia, grows his hair really long to avoid eye contact, gets upset if he feels stared at.
Very specific examples.
Yeah. And in an anime called Active Raid, a character named Marimo Kaburagi actually uses special glasses to manage her scopophobia.
Glasses? How?
They digitally blur or censor the eyes of people she looks at, a very literal way to avoid the feeling of being seen.
Wow. That's creative.
Yeah. Then you get into more fantastical stuff. The SCP Foundation online project has SCP-096, the Shy Guy.
Right, the one that reacts violently if you see its face.
Exactly, even in photos or videos. An extreme, monstrous version of reacting to being seen.
And Minecraft.
Yeah, the source playfully suggests the Endermen, they get hostile if you look right at them. Maybe that's a kind of scopophobia.
Huh. It's interesting how this real anxiety pops up in so many different fictional forms.
It really is. It shows how fundamental that fear of being watched can be, I think. Even exaggerated, these characters can sometimes help us understand the feeling.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels clear that scopophobia is, it's much more than just being a bit shy.
Definitely. It's a significant anxiety disorder. It has specific triggers, a whole range of symptoms, mental and physical.
Potential roots in trauma or experience, deeper psychological ideas behind it too. And it's not new. It's been recognized for over a century.
Right. And for you, the listener, hopefully understanding this gives some insight into, the whole spectrum of social anxieties and just how much our perception of being seen can impact us.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. We live in this age of social media, right? Constant digital gazing, you could say.
Yeah. Constant visibility.
So how might that constant visibility, even if it's curated by us, be changing how we experience or understand scopophobia? Is it making us more anxious about being seen or maybe desensitizing us?
That's a really interesting question for the future. Definitely something to think about.
It is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.